all know a little bit about me because I was on a panel yesterday, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much. But yes, I'm married to Tim. We've been married it'll be 8 years in January, and we're involved in a church plant in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Before this time last year, we just finished off 4 years in Sydney. So my husband was studying at Moore College and I was working full-time for our church, Chatswood Baptist, doing children's and women's ministry. And then we moved back down to Melbourne, where we originally came from, and started a church. Started off in a lounge room and eventually moved into a public venue, and been in that public venue since the end of July, I think. And it's been a very, very interesting year, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more. I thought the way that I would talk about things, because I could just rabbit on for ages about all the things that I've learnt, but I thought in terms of a structure I'd talk about what did I expect in terms of going into church planting, what was it actually like, what were some of the struggles, what were some of the joys of this last year, and particularly thinking about what are some of the interesting dynamics that Tim and I have had to work out in terms of our marriage and our relationship in the process of church planting. So hopefully that will be helpful to you, whatever stage you're at. So when I think back to my expectations about church planting, it's quite hard to think about, actually. It really depends on what stage of the process we're at. I think when church planting was just an idea, I had lots of romantic visions of, lots of people who didn't know Jesus flooding into my house for cups of coffee, and lots of people becoming Christians, and all these kind of romantic ideas. As the time got closer, I got scareder. And so I think at that point, it's hard to think about what the expectations were at that point, because I think I just didn't know what the next year was going to be like, and I was a bit nervous about it, so I tried not to think about it too much. So I'm someone who generally doesn't love change, and also I really like to be able to picture what things are going to be like. If I'm going to be starting a new workplace, I want to know where my desk is. I want to be able to see myself working there in order to be able to prepare for it. And really for church planting, I just didn't have a picture in my head. And so in some ways I just went, okay, this is what we're doing. I'm going to pray, I'm going to ask God to help me, and then I'm just going to block it out until we start. But the funny thing is, I think in terms of expectations, and this is a little bit embarrassing to admit, I think one of the expectations that I had was I thought that I would be a really good church planter's wife. What I mean by that is that I'd already had a fair bit of ministry experience when we started, and Tim and I had done ministry together and actually worked quite well together. And I was someone who loved evangelism and had kind of spent a lot of my ministry life doing lots of evangelism. So I think I had in my head that, it's going to be hard, but I think I'm going to do a good job. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that now, but to be honest, that was a big part of my expectations. And one of the things that I had to deal with over this year is this feeling that, I can do this. This is going to be good. Yeah, I'm going to be great. So when it came to the actual what it was really like, there were a lot of things that I should say another one in terms of expectations is people had told me that church planting would be hard. So we had someone in Melbourne who was kind of, I think, a year or two ahead of us, and they said to Tim and I just before we started, your first year of church planting will be the hardest year of your life. I remember that. And Tim and I went away from that conversation and we said, they don't know how hard we've had it. Tim and I had been through some really tough things in the preceding years, and it had been challenging, but God had got us through. And so we really thought, yes, it's going to be hard, but we've done hard, we can handle hard. Surely it's not that bad. What we actually found out was that church planting, the first year of church planting, is actually really hard. I don't think it's kind of overall hard. Like, I wouldn't look back over this year and say it was the most terrible year of my life or that I was miserable all the time. But there were definitely periods of time where it was really, really hard, particularly in the early stage that Tim talked about, of the kind of first 6 months where we really felt like nothing's happening, like we're putting all this effort in, we're working so hard and no one seems to be joining and nothing seems to be happening and we feel like we're letting our team down and our supporters down. That period of time was just really hard for a number of reasons that I'll talk about. But I still remember when we moved back down to Melbourne, Tim had set up my computer and he'd put as our screensaver a photo that I'd taken in our first year of marriage. It was one of those kind of, I went up behind Tim and went like click and did a bit of a selfie, and we're both smiling, and I'd always loved that photo because it reminded me of kind of the fun of the first year of marriage. And I just remember one day last year just sitting at the computer crying, looking at this photo going, I wish I could be that Belinda because she doesn't have to church plant. So just like, I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a picture of, there were actually some really tough times of just thinking, this is so hard. It's so hard seeing Tim struggling so much. I just don't know if I can do this. So there really were periods of time where I'd say it was just some of the hardest periods of my life have been in the last year. Some of the one of the hard things, and I think one of the things that we didn't expect, I guess, which I've already kind of touched on, is the slowness of it. That church planting is actually a lot of work and it's very slow. One of the things that I think I've reflected with some of the other wives about is often when we come to these kind of conferences, the husbands are all like, this has happened and this is really good and woohoo, and isn't it great what God's doing, and you're sitting back going, but God hasn't done that for us yet. Does that mean there's something wrong with me? And you hear about other church plants and how they're going, and so I think we'd had these expectations that things would happen. We weren't exactly sure how they would happen, but they'd happen quickly. But things were actually just really slow. It just took a long time for people to hear about us. And I think in some ways it took a while for us to get to the critical mass where when people visited, they kind of went, I could join this. I think at first we were so small that people kind of went, maybe when you're bigger I might join. So I think that was a real challenge, the kind of slowness of it. And as I already touched on before, I think that very nature of not seeing the numerical group growth at the start was really interesting in making Tim and I think about, why are we doing this? What is, God may not be growing our numbers yet, but what is God doing? And actually reflecting on the people in our team, how they were growing. The Sunday school particularly, I think being involved in that for me was encouraging because I could really see the way the kids were getting excited about God and growing and thinking, actually, this is really worthwhile what we're doing. It's not a waste. It's really important. It's actually doing great things for the kingdom, even if it's small. I think another thing that surprised me a bit was how evangelism takes time. I know it's stupid that I didn't know this anyway, but I think I went into church planting thinking, I love evangelism, I'm an evangelist, this is going to be great. But until that point, all my models of evangelism had been in an established large church context. So I'd done a lot of playgroup evangelism where non-Christian women just turned up and I spent time with them and I built relationships with them and I invited them to my Bible study and shared Jesus with them. But in a new church plant, you just don't have any structures for evangelism. It really has to all be relational and you have to meet people. And we'd come back to Melbourne with lots of good Christian friends, but having it's sad, but kind of lost a lot of our non-Christian contacts. And so it just took a lot of time for Tim and I to actually build real relationships with people so that we could start talking about Jesus. And I think I was quite surprised just how long that took and how challenging that was for me, for someone who thought that was something I was really good at, to find out actually it is challenging and something that I need to keep working on and learning from. Another thing that I don't think I expected was how much work church planting was and how busy Tim would be. Tim is one of those people who he's someone who's fairly kind of laid back and cruisy kind of personality, and a lot of ministry things come very naturally to him. And so even though we'd done MTS together and I'd seen him do lots of ministry, I hadn't seen him do just church planting. There was just so much to do and Tim had to do so much of it. And I think I just didn't expect how busy and how full on it would be and how much it would just absorb life. How much, every, dinner conversation would be about, but what are we going to do about this? And what do you think about this? And how's this going to work? And I'm really worried about this. And just how church planting just took over our lives. I don't think I quite expected that. So those were some of the kind of actual and expectation stuff that I found that happened. Now I'm going to talk about some of the struggles, which I've kind of already touched on a little bit, but I thought it'd be good to think about some of the things that have been a bit of a challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges we found with church planting was trusting God, not necessarily knowing that our church plant would work, but trusting God anyway. So God never made a promise to us that our church plant was going to work. God never kind of tapped him on the shoulder and said, you're going to plant a church in Box Hill and it's going to grow and wonderful things are going to happen. We prayed and asked God for wisdom and talked with others who knew us. And in faith, we just went, well, we think this is a good thing to do. But we went into it knowing that God might choose to be glorified by our church not making it. And that's a really hard thing. It's really hard to trust God with that uncertainty. And I think that has been one of the real struggles for me, to keep honouring and trusting God and to keep doing what God wants me to do, living with that uncertainty. I am someone who likes to plan and to know the future and just to continue to do God's work, not knowing what's going to happen, I think was a real struggle for me. And I think God has helped me a lot through that. But that was, I think, one of the biggest struggles for me, just trusting God with the uncertainty of what was going to happen with our church. I think another one of the big struggles has been in terms of relationships. Relationships with people at church and feeling the expectations of things have to happen, otherwise you're going to feel let down by me, or you're not going to like me, or just those kind of personal things. And also there was a lot of kind of wanting to encourage people to be involved, get on board. And I actually found that really challenging. And Tim got me to do a lot of the... It seemed like a lot of our visitors at first were women, and so I was the one who had to kind of go and have the coffee and do the big sell, and I just found that really challenging. I felt like I was putting myself on the line all the time in relationships, and that was just a real challenge for me, I think. Another challenge which was really interesting, I think, is so I'd been working in ministry for 3 years before we started the church plant, while Tim was at Bible college, so I was kind of the full-time ministry one and he was studying. And pretty much all through our relationship, Tim has been the emotional rock and I've been the basket case. I'm quite an emotional person. I get really involved in ministry. I get really stressed. And Tim's always been the one kind of looking after me and it's going to be okay. And one of the big challenges of church planting has been that there's been times where it's actually been the other way around, where Tim's just really needed me to be the rock. And that's hard because I'm not used to that. And I think at first I resented that a bit, which is silly because he's been serving me in that way for so long. Of course, I should be, honoured and privileged to be able to do the same thing for him. But I think that was a real struggle for me, actually getting used to having to be the strong one sometimes. And then the other thing I think that's been it's interesting. It's kind of a good one to finish on because it's been both a struggle and a joy, I think. But one of the things I found really hard is what we're doing is really, it's unusual. Independent church planting without a mother church is fairly unusual anyway, but it's very, very unusual in Melbourne. People don't tend to do it. And so, you'd have a conversation, what are you guys doing? Oh, well, Tim and I are actually involved in a church plant. Oh, what's your sending church? Oh, we don't have one. Oh, you don't have one? Oh, well, what denomination are you with? Oh, well, we're kind of independent. We're part of this FIC that you've never heard of. And so, and you're doing it in Box Hill. Why aren't you doing it in Caroline Springs or somewhere that doesn't have church? It just felt like every time I talked about what we were doing, I would have to kind of justify what it was about and why. And that's actually really hard and exhausting. But it's interesting. Over the year, my view on that process started to actually change. Something that Tim and I have been praying for is that not just that our church would serve God by, having people come to know Him and grow in Him, but that also our church might have a wider influence on the churches in Melbourne and the people in Melbourne. And so one of the things that I actually started to find was all these conversations where we'd have to justify what we were doing, it suddenly stopped being about me making people think highly of me, and it actually started to be about me thinking, well, this person's never really thought about all the lost in our city and how we're going to reach them, or this person's never thought about how their church could do evangelism. Maybe in my answer, I actually might be able to encourage them. And so over time, I actually got to a point where that was actually one of the joys of church planting, that we were doing this weird thing that nobody understood, and that I got an opportunity to talk about our church and its vision and what really mattered to a whole lot of people because of it. So that's actually something that started off as a struggle but actually became a real joy for me. Other things that have been a joy, I touched on this yesterday, so I won't go into it, but seeing people in the church get excited about evangelism, I think that has been a real highlight. I still remember, so we had our little training group and we used to pray every week for opportunities to share the gospel. And I still remember this one week where every single person who came had a conversation about God that week. And we just and I think we all just sat around and went, wow, God is really answering our prayers. This is so exciting. And I think just seeing the way that people in our congregation, even when we were small, were growing, it was just really exciting. It's funny, we had a couple of girls in our congregation, a set of sisters who had left a kind of large established church to come to our church. And I think we always felt a bit guilty. You know, they've left this huge church with lots of people their own age to come to our church. And I remember talking to one of the girls about it and saying, you know, do you miss your old church? And she said, it was funny, she said to me, not even a little bit. And she said, in this church, I get to hear the Bible taught really well. I get to be around people who care about evangelism. And she had some particular health issues that meant that there were difficulties in terms of her ability to serve. And she said, and I felt like at my old church, no one understood my illness, and they didn't bother to understand or get to know me because, you know, I wasn't around as much because I was sick. But I feel like at this church, people not only care for me, but they actually value my ministry and what I do and who I am. And so it's that kind of stuff that when you hear it, you go, yeah, it's so worth it. It's so worth what we're doing. So that was a huge encouragement to me. Another thing that's been a huge joy, I think, as I said at the start it felt like we didn't know many non-Christians and we struggled to meet them. But one of the real joys, I think, for me with church planting is that because we're starting new, because there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how we spent our time, Tim and I were able to go, okay, meeting people who don't know Jesus is a real priority, and we're going to spend our time doing that. And so one of the things that we did was Tim and I joined a local choir. Tim sings quite well, I sing okay, and that was a way that we could meet people who weren't Christians. We also started this English conversation club in the local library where we ended up with about 15 people who weren't Christians, and each week we would practice our English and then read the Bible. And it's just actually been so lovely that at least once a week, well, actually it's probably twice a week at least, Tim and I are spending quality time with people who don't know Jesus. And it's great. I just love it. They're wonderful people. I love them to pieces. I pray for them. I really want them to come to know Jesus. And I just think that's just been one of the huge joys of church planting, that we've actually had time and energy to be able to devote to those who don't know Christ. And that's just, that's a real privilege and a joy. Another great thing has been seeing Tim doing ministry. I've known the whole time that I've known him that this was what God made Tim to do. God made Tim to preach the gospel and to train and teach, and it's just so cool actually being out there and seeing him do that. It's hard work, and sometimes I struggle with, the busyness, and sometimes I wish that we could go back to college Tim, who had lots of more time and energy for me. But at the same time, I'm really seeing Tim be the man that God has made him to be, and that's a real privilege and a joy and a wonderful thing to see. And the other thing that's been a really wonderful thing about this year is just seeing God answer prayers. It was funny. We had a period of time. It was funny. So Tim and I have been struggling for many years praying for children and not having them. And there was this one week where we had a whole lot of new people come to church that we didn't have a connection with. Up to that point, people who'd visited, we either knew they were coming or they knew, or they were someone we knew personally. We had a whole lot of people come who didn't know Jesus, and we were just so excited. And then the next day we found out I was pregnant, which was just amazing. And then the following week we prayed and we said, oh God, it was just so amazing that we had these new people last week. We just really like to have more new people this week. But when we prayed, God had been so gracious to us that week. We just didn't think he was going to answer that prayer. And we turned up at church and there were more new people. And it was just so incredible. And it was funny, Tim said, I know we should pray all the time, but now that God's been answering prayers, I just want to pray all the time. And so it's such a privilege. We don't feel, we're very aware that anything that happens with our church plant, it's not really us. Like the first half of the year, we did the same thing as we did in the second half of the year, but in the second half of the year, amazing things were happening. It wasn't because of anything special we did or any kind of efforts that we put in. It was just God's grace. God's grace to the people to us, and also God's grace to the people who were coming along and learning and growing and things. So I think that's been one of the real joys of this year, is just being reminded that we have a God who cares for us and who answers prayers. That's just been a real blessing to see. And it makes me think, regardless of what happens with the church plan in the future, it's worth it. It's worth it to give it a try. It's worth it. All the hard things, all the struggles have been worth it, because our God is good and he's worth suffering for. Now, to finish off, I just wanted to go through a couple of specific things to do with Tim and my relationship. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about, Renee's kind of touched on as well. So it's interesting hearing her things and going, yep, I know that. Yep, that's so true. I think the real challenge for us has been that kind of colleague versus couple thing and working out what that looks like. So one of the challenges has been, so I've been pretty much 3 days a week working at church. And so in many ways I've been not in the same situation as Tim, but I've been working hard and being part of the church plant. And so often I can want to be the colleague. I can want to talk about things or critique things. And actually what Tim just needs is a wife, someone to be there and to encourage him. And my default is, this is our ministry, we're working together. But one of the things that I need to keep remembering is that Tim is in a really unique position. He is the leader of the church, and there's a lot of pressures and stresses on him that can be quite overwhelming, and that I'm the only one. I'm his only wife. I'm the only one who's in a position to serve him in that particular way. I'm the loudest voice in his ear, and so I want to make sure that voice is an encouraging voice. There's been Tim's been really good at really being quite communicative about this. I still remember one day when Tim had this idea of a ministry thing, and I was like, "Oh, darling, I just don't think that's going to work," or "It's just not a good." Like, that was my first response, and Tim just said to me, "Darling, I actually need a wife and not a handbrake." And it was just, one of those things you really don't like to hear, but just so helpful that he was able to really put into words the way that I'd been acting. And it just really challenged me to think, wow, actually, I need to really think about what I say to Tim. That's the kind of power that you have. And so that was really challenging for me to actually go, I need to actually step back and let him be the leader and to be encouraging. And that doesn't mean that I don't raise concerns but I just need to make sure that actually encouraging him is the main thing that I do. There's also been a little bit the other way. So sometimes when Tim's really stressed about something and needs me to do something, he'll just say, "Hey, Bindi, go do this." And I've needed to kind of pull him up and go, I'm a wife, not a servant, not a secretary. And, even the little things of, so I said to him, it might sound like the smallest thing in the world, but if you say, "Please, darling, can you do this for me?" as opposed to just "do this," that can actually make all the difference in terms of my attitude towards it. So I think one of the big things that I've learnt from this whole church planting thing, and I mean it's what every marriage book says, communication is important, but it's just so important that through this whole thing that Tim and I have been really honest with each other about how we've been feeling and about what we've needed. It hasn't actually come naturally to me to know when to be the wife and when to be the colleague, and so I actually need to talk. Sometimes I'll say to Tim, "What do you need at the moment? Do you need me to say you did a really good job, or do you want some feedback?" And he'll say, "I need you to say I did a really good job," and I'll say, "Okay, darling, you did a really good job." So I think that's a really important and helpful part of the process. Now, I started off by saying that my expectations of myself were very high when we went into church planting. And I think one of the challenges of this year has been that I haven't lived up to my expectations. I haven't always been the best wife that I could be. I haven't always been the best Sunday school teacher, the best discipler, the best evangelist that I could be. And that's a really challenging thing for me to say and for me to admit. But one of the great things I think about being Christian is that we're not saved by what we do, we're saved by grace, and that God in his grace has been able to use Tim and I in our imperfections, in our weaknesses, to glorify himself. And that's been a really wonderful thing to be reminded of. And I think sometimes when you come along to these kind of things and you hear all these different things about what church planting is like, and particularly for those on this kind of side of the room, you can feel like, I just can't do this. But actually God is gracious and he can use us. And so I just really want to encourage you that yes, church planting is hard, but that it is worth it, and that God in his grace can use even broken people like me to achieve his purposes in church planting. So thanks everyone.